The rancher was on the edge of death, until she brought him back to life. The rancher had lived on that land for more than 40 years. The wide fields, the wooden fences, the old barn, and the small house were not just property to him. They were his whole life. Every sunrise he woke before the sun, and every sunset he worked until the sky turned dark. His hands were rough, his back was bent, and his face showed the marks of long years spent under heat, cold, and wind. People in the nearby town knew him as a quiet man who rarely spoke and never complained. He had once had a family. Long ago, laughter had filled the house. There had been warm meals on the table and voices calling his name. But time took those things away one by one. His parents passed away first. Then his wife became sick and left the world quietly, leaving behind a silence that never fully faded. His children moved far away, chasing their own lives. Letters became rare. Phone calls stopped. Slowly, the ranch became the only place where he still felt useful. The land depended on him, and that gave him a reason to wake up every morning. Even as his body grew weaker, he refused to slow down. He fed the animals himself, repaired fences alone, and carried heavy tools even when his hands trembled. He told himself he was fine. He always had. Pain became normal. Tiredness became a companion. He believed resting was for people who had someone to rest for. Winter arrived early that year. The wind was sharp, and the nights were colder than usual. Snow had not fully covered the ground yet, but the air carried a deep chill. That evening, the rancher was outside checking the animals before nightfall. His breath came out in short white clouds. As he walked, a tight pain grew in his chest. He stopped for a moment, pressing his hand against it. He waited for the pain to pass as it usually did, but this time it didn't. His vision blurred and the ground felt unsteady under his feet. He tried to take another step, but his legs felt heavy, like they no longer belonged to him. Fear rose quietly inside him, not loud or dramatic, but deep and heavy. He looked around the empty land. There was no one nearby, no sound except the wind and the animals shifting in their pens. He forced himself to move toward the house. Each step felt harder than the last. His heart beat fast, then slow, then uneven. By the time he reached the front door, sweat covered his face even though the air was cold. His hands shook as he unlocked the door. Inside, the house was dark and still. The familiar smell of wood and old furniture surrounded him, but it brought no comfort. He collapsed into a chair, breathing hard. The pain spread through his chest and down his arm. He tried to stand again, thinking he should reach the phone. It sat on a small table across the room, just a few steps away. But when he stood, his legs gave out. He fell to the floor, hitting it hard. The sound echoed briefly, then disappeared into silence. He lay there, staring at the ceiling. The house felt larger than ever, emptier than it had ever been. Memories came without warning. His wife standing by the window, smiling softly. His children running across the yard, laughing. A younger version of himself, strong and full of plans. He wondered when exactly life had slipped away from him, leaving only work behind. His breathing became shallow. He thought about calling out, but there was no one to hear him. The nearest neighbor lived miles away. Even if someone passed by, it was unlikely they would stop. He had always kept to himself. Now that choice felt heavy. He did not feel angry. He felt tired. A strange calm settled over him. The pain was still there, but his thoughts slowed. He wondered if this was how it ended. Alone on the floor of the house he built, surrounded by the land he loved. He thought of the animals outside and hoped someone would take care of them. Time passed in a way he could no longer measure. The light outside faded and the room grew darker. His eyes closed for a moment, then opened again. He struggled to stay awake, afraid that if he let go, he might not return. His heart beat weakly now. Each breath felt like effort. Somewhere far away, a car drove along the road leading past the ranch. The sound was distant, almost unreal. He did not hear it clearly. He did not know that this night would be different from all the others. As he lay there, his thoughts drifted to a simple question he had never asked himself before. Had his life mattered to anyone in the end? He had worked hard. He had been honest. He had loved deeply, even if he did not always show it. Was that enough? The cold from the floor crept into his body. His fingers barely moved. His eyes fixed on the ceiling beam above him, the same beam he had placed there decades ago with his own hands. He remembered being proud that day, proud of building something that would last. A soft sound came from outside, footsteps on gravel, faint, uncertain but real. The rancher did not hear them clearly. He was too weak. His world had shrunk to shallow breaths and fading thoughts. But somewhere beyond the walls of the house, a presence was drawing closer, unaware that a life inside was hanging by a thin thread. And in that quiet moment, when the rancher stood closer to the edge than he had ever been, fate was already moving toward the door. The wind howled outside the old ranch house, rattling the windows and shaking the wooden walls. The snow had started to fall in small, soft flakes, covering the ground in a thin white blanket. The rancher still lay on the cold floor, too weak to move, too tired even to cry out. Time seemed to stretch endlessly inside that quiet, empty house. The world outside moved on, but inside, everything had frozen. Far away on the same road, a young woman was driving. She had been traveling for hours, looking for a place to rest after a long day. She was on her way to help at a neighboring farm for the winter season, delivering supplies and assisting with chores. The road had been empty for miles, and the snow had made it even more difficult to see. She was careful, slowing down and focusing on the path ahead. The headlights of her car cut through the falling snow, shining over the wide, open fields. As she passed the old ranch, something caught her eye. A dim light flickered inside the house. At first, she thought it might be a reflection from the snow, or perhaps the light from a candle. But then she noticed a movement, or perhaps a shadow, crossing the window. She slowed her car to a stop, her instincts telling her that someone might need help. She stepped out into the cold, pulling her coat tightly around her. The wind bit at her cheeks, and the snowflakes melted on her eyelashes. The house looked abandoned at first glance. The paint on the walls was chipped, and the roof sagged slightly under the weight of the snow. But there was something different about this place, something that drew her closer. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should knock on the door. The silence around the house was deep, almost too quiet. Then she remembered the movement she had seen. She couldn't just leave. Not when someone might be in trouble. She approached the front door, her boots crunching in the snow. She knocked softly at first, then louder when there was no response. She called out, her voice carrying in the cold air. "Hello. Is anyone there?" The wind answered her with a cold whistle, but no human voice came back. Her heart started to race. She could feel that something was wrong. She didn't know who lived here, or even if anyone lived here, but something in her gut told her to keep going. Carefully, she pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty house. Inside, the air was cold and still. The smell of old wood and dust filled her nose. She called out again, but there was only silence. She stepped further inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. Then she saw him. The rancher was lying on the floor, his face pale and drawn. His chest rose and fell slowly, and his hands twitched weakly. She rushed to him, fear and urgency filling her chest. She had never seen anyone in such a state. She knelt beside him and tried to wake him, gently shaking his shoulder. "Sir, are you okay? Can you hear me?" She spoke again and again, but his eyes remained closed. Her mind raced. She had learned basic first aid during a short training course years ago, but this was different. This was real life, not a classroom. She checked his pulse. It was weak and irregular. She checked his breathing. It was shallow. Panic rose in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't let fear take over. She needed to act. She remembered the emergency number and pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed. 911. I need help, please, quickly. Someone is unconscious. He's not breathing properly. His heart, I think it's failing. She gave the operator the ranch's address, her voice steady even as her heart pounded. The operator stayed on the line, giving her instructions. She followed the instructions carefully, doing everything she could to keep him alive. She tilted his head back to open his airway. She checked his mouth for any obstruction. She began chest compressions, counting carefully as the operator guided her. Her arms ached quickly, but she kept going. She refused to stop. She refused to give up. The snow outside continued to fall, the wind howling against the walls, but inside all that mattered was him. Minutes passed like hours. She felt her own energy draining, her body trembling from exhaustion and cold. Still, she could not stop. Every breath he took, every faint pulse gave her hope. She whispered to him, words of encouragement even if he couldn't hear them. Hold on just a little longer, help is coming. She spoke softly, her voice breaking at times, but her hands remained steady. Finally, the sound of sirens reached her ears, muffled by the snow but unmistakable. Relief washed over her, but she did not let herself relax. She stayed with him, continuing to follow the operator's instructions until the paramedics arrived. They rushed inside, quickly assessing the situation. They thanked her for her quick thinking and took over, lifting him carefully onto a stretcher. She watched as they carried him out, the cold wind hitting her face. She followed them to the ambulance, answering their questions as best as she could. She felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and hope. She had never expected her day to turn out this way, but somehow she had been in the right place at the right time. Somehow her presence had made a difference. The ambulance doors closed and the vehicle drove off into the night, its lights cutting through the snow. She stood there for a moment, looking at the empty house. The wind was still cold, the snow still falling, but the feeling inside her had changed. She had saved a life. She had done something important. As she walked back to her car, she thought about the rancher. Who was he? How had he lived alone for so long? How close had he been to the end? She did not know the answers, but she felt a connection to him, a sense of responsibility. She knew she would not forget this night, not ever. For the rancher, unconscious and fighting for life in the ambulance, the world had changed without him even knowing it. His life, which had seemed so quiet and ordinary, had suddenly intersected with someone else's in a way that would alter the course of everything. He had been on the edge of death, alone and forgotten, but now there was hope. And that hope was in the hands of a young woman who refused to walk away. The journey to the hospital was tense. The paramedics worked quickly, monitoring his vital signs, giving him oxygen, and preparing him for immediate care. The young woman rode with them, answering questions, giving them the information she knew about his condition and what she had done to help. She watched anxiously as the monitors beeped, as they explained his critical condition. She realized that even though he had survived this far, the battle was far from over. Hours passed in the hospital emergency room. Doctors moved quickly, analyzing tests, stabilizing his heart and lungs, and doing everything necessary to keep him alive. She stayed nearby, sitting in a hard chair, her hands folded, her mind racing. She could see the faint rise and fall of his chest through the small curtain. Every movement gave her hope, every silence brought fear. Throughout the night, she learned small things about him from the hospital staff. He had been a rancher all his life, they said. He lived alone. He had no immediate family nearby. She realized how fragile life could be, how quickly it could turn, and how often people like him were forgotten. She felt grateful that she had been there to help, yet a quiet sadness settled over her. The world had almost lost someone important, someone whose life had been devoted to hard work and love for the land. As morning approached, the rancher's condition slowly stabilized. His breathing became steadier. The doctors nodded, signaling small victories. The young woman felt a wave of relief wash over her. But she also knew that the journey was not over. Recovery would be long. Healing would be difficult. And the bond between them, formed in the quiet desperation of that snowy night, would shape the days ahead in ways neither of them could yet understand. By the time the first sunlight spilled into the hospital room, the rancher was still unconscious, but alive. The young woman sat beside him, watching his chest rise and fall with each breath. She thought about how fragile life was, how quickly it could slip away, and how one person's courage and presence could change everything. She realized that her choice to stop, to help, had made the difference between life and death. And in that quiet, sunlit room, as the snow continued to fall outside, a story had begun that would transform both their lives forever. The rancher, unaware of how close he had come to the edge, had been given a second chance. And the young woman who had walked into a lonely house on a snowy night had become the reason he would live to see another day. The rancher slowly began to awaken, but the world felt strange and unfamiliar. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of machines and the soft murmur of nurses moving in the distance. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he could not remember where he was. The bright lights hurt his eyes and the smell of antiseptic made him wince. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain ran through his chest and arms, forcing him back against the pillow. A young woman was sitting in the chair beside his bed. She looked tired, her coat and scarf still damp from the snow outside. When she saw his eyes open, she smiled softly, relief shining in her face. "You're awake," she said gently. Her voice was calm, warm, and full of care. The rancher tried to speak, but his throat was dry and his lips barely moved. She leaned closer, helping him sip water from a small cup. The taste was simple, but it brought back a small sense of normalcy. He wanted to ask her name, to thank her for saving his life, but his voice was weak, and his thoughts were slow. Memories of the night before came in flashes. The snow falling, the cold wind, the pain in his chest, and the darkness closing in around him. He remembered the fear, the loneliness, and then her, the stranger who had entered his life when he had no hope left. He wanted to speak, but the words felt trapped in his throat. The young woman noticed his struggle. "Take your time," she said softly. "You're safe now. You're going to be okay." She reached out and gently held his hand. Her touch was warm, grounding him in a way he had almost forgotten was possible. He looked at her, studying her face, the way her hair fell over her shoulders, the concern in her eyes, the small crease in her forehead from worry. She didn't seem like someone who would have anything to gain from helping him, yet she had risked herself to save his life. The doctors entered the room quietly. They checked his vital signs and examined him carefully. They explained that his condition had been very serious, closer to the edge than he could imagine. If she had not found him, or if he had remained on the floor a little longer, he might not have survived the night. The rancher listened to their words, stunned. He had been living his life thinking he was strong, thinking he could face anything, and yet he had been so close to death. The realization shook him more than the illness itself. He felt weak, vulnerable, and yet strangely grateful. He looked back at the young woman who was still holding his hand. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough and almost unrecognizable. She smiled and nodded, not needing more words. She understood. The following days were a blur of treatment and recovery. The rancher's body was battered, but his spirit slowly began to awaken. The doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him, adjusting his medications, monitoring his heart, and helping him regain strength. Nurses visited frequently, checking on him, encouraging him, and sometimes sharing small stories to distract him from the monotony of recovery. But through it all, the young woman remained a constant presence. She visited daily, helping him with simple tasks. She fed him, helped him sit up, guided him to walk short distances, and kept him company. They spoke little at first, mostly about practical things, his condition, the treatments, his hospital schedule. But gradually, conversations began to drift into deeper territory. She asked about his life on the ranch, his work with the animals, and his experiences over the years. Slowly, the rancher began to open up, telling stories of his past, his family, and the hardships he had endured. He spoke about the long winters, the crops, and the animals he had cared for with his own hands. He told her about the times he had felt completely alone, and how the land had been his only companion. He shared memories of his wife, of his children, and of the friends he had lost over the years. Each story revealed a piece of him that had been hidden, a side of his life that no one had ever really seen. The young woman listened quietly, never interrupting, never judging. She asked questions that encouraged him to remember, to reflect, and to share. Her presence gave him comfort, a sense of security he had not felt in decades. For the first time in many years, he realized that someone genuinely cared, not just about his survival, but about him as a person. The isolation he had accepted as normal began to feel like a burden he no longer had to carry alone. At times, the rancher's health would falter, and he would experience moments of fear and weakness. His chest still ached, his legs trembled, and his energy would fade quickly. Each setback frustrated him, but the young woman remained patient and encouraging. She reminded him to be gentle with himself, to take one day at a time, and to celebrate every small victory. Her kindness was unwavering, and her belief in his recovery became a source of strength he hadn't realized he needed. One evening, as the snow fell outside the hospital window, they sat together in silence. The rancher looked at her, thinking about how a stranger had become his lifeline. He realized how fragile life was, how quickly it could change, and how much he had taken for granted. The land, the animals, the routines, they had been his world, but they were not enough to keep him alive on their own. Human connection, he now understood, was just as important as hard work and perseverance. He began to feel emotions he had buried long ago, gratitude, hope, and even a sense of humility. He admitted silently at first that he had been wrong to isolate himself for so long. Life was not meant to be lived alone. He had survived because someone had shown compassion, because someone had cared enough to take action when it mattered most. The thought of that made him both thankful and determined. He would not waste this second chance. Over time, he began to regain some strength. Short walks around the hospital hallway became part of his routine. He learned to eat more solid food, to move without assistance, and to speak more clearly. Each day brought new challenges, but also small victories. And through it all, the young woman remained by his side, guiding, supporting, and encouraging him. Their bond grew, not romantic but deeply human. It was built on trust, gratitude, and shared experience. During one of these walks, the rancher paused to look out the hospital window at the snow-covered fields. He thought about his land, his animals, and the life he had temporarily left behind. He realized that he had been given an opportunity not just to survive, but to change. He could return to his ranch with a new perspective, a renewed sense of purpose, and an appreciation for the people who truly mattered. The young woman noticed his thoughtful expression and asked softly, "Are you ready to go home soon?" The rancher smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Yes," he said quietly, "I think I am." The words felt heavy with meaning. He was not just ready to leave the hospital. He was ready to face life again, to embrace the world with all its challenges, and to live with intention and gratitude. As his recovery continued, the rancher began to plan for the future. He thought about the changes he would make to his daily routine, how he would ask for help when needed, and how he would reconnect with the community he had long ignored. He realized that survival was not just about physical strength. It was about relationships, trust, and the willingness to accept care from others. The young woman, in turn, discovered the profound impact one person could have on another's life. She had entered the rancher's world on a snowy night, expecting little more than a quiet task. Yet she had become the reason he lived, the person who helped him rediscover hope. Her presence reminded her that even small actions, driven by care and courage, could change the course of someone's life forever. By the end of part 3, the rancher was no longer just a patient fighting to survive. He was a man beginning to see life through new eyes, aware of the fragility of existence and the importance of human connection. He understood that his time on earth was not infinite, but that each day mattered. And he carried with him a quiet determination to honor the second chance he had been given, not just by surviving, but by truly living, and by cherishing the people who had made that survival possible. For the young woman, too, the experience had left an indelible mark. She had witnessed the thin line between life and death, and the power of compassion and courage. She realized that helping another person, even a stranger, could create ripples of hope and change that neither of them could fully predict. Their lives were now connected in ways that went beyond words, rooted in a night of snow, fear, and bravery, a night that had changed both of them forever. Weeks passed since the rancher had first been brought to the hospital. Each day he felt a little stronger, a little more aware of the world around him. The sharp pain that had once made him collapse was now replaced with lingering aches, reminders of the fragility of life. His movements were slow, deliberate, careful, but he could walk, eat, and speak with increasing confidence. More importantly, his spirit, which had been heavy with loneliness and despair, was beginning to lift. The young woman had become a constant in his life. She visited every day, often bringing small comforts from the outside world, a warm blanket, a favorite snack, or just her presence. They spoke more now, their conversations no longer limited to immediate needs or health instructions. They shared stories of childhood, of dreams, of mistakes and lessons learned. For the first time in many years, the rancher felt someone truly listened, someone genuinely cared. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed gently through the hospital window, the rancher asked her, "Why did you stop? Why did you come inside that night?" His voice was still weak, but there was curiosity now, not fear. The young woman smiled softly. "I don't know exactly," she said. "Something told me to. Maybe it was luck, maybe it was instinct, but I couldn't just leave you there. No one deserves to face something like that alone." Her words struck him deeply. He realized how close he had been to death, how the decision of one person had saved him. He had always believed that life was about working hard, enduring pain, and facing challenges alone. Now he understood that life was also about connection, about letting others in, about accepting care when it was offered. The lesson was quiet, profound, and humbling. As the rancher continued to recover, he found himself reflecting on the life he had lived. He had spent decades focused on the land, the animals, and his routines. He had believed that his work defined him, that survival was the ultimate goal. But now he saw that survival without connection, without love and care, was hollow. He began to think of the neighbors he had ignored, the friends he had not stayed in touch with, and the family he had not reached out to in years. The young woman encouraged him gently. "It's not too late," she said one day as they sat together in the hospital garden. "You can start again. You can build the life you want, but this time with people around you." He nodded slowly. Her words made sense, but change felt difficult. Decades of isolation were not easily undone. Yet for the first time he felt hope, a spark that had been missing for years. Their bond grew in subtle ways. She did not rush him, did not impose herself. She simply stayed, shared small moments of kindness, and offered gentle encouragement. They laughed together at small mistakes, the time he spilled water while trying to drink too quickly, or when he tripped lightly during their short walks. Humor, simple and unpretentious, became a part of their daily lives. It reminded the rancher of joys he had forgotten, small moments that had once made life worth living. One evening, As the sun set and the hospital lights reflected softly on the walls, the rancher shared a story from his youth. He spoke of the first time he had cared for a sick animal, a lamb that had been abandoned in the snow. He described the fear, the uncertainty, and the relief he felt when the lamb survived. The young woman listened attentively, her eyes reflecting empathy and admiration. "You have always had a big heart," she said softly. "It's just that sometimes the world makes it hard to see." The rancher smiled faintly. He realized she was right. His heart had always been there, full of care and responsibility, but life's hardships and his own choices had hidden it. Now, with someone noticing, acknowledging, and valuing it, he felt something he had not felt in decades: recognition. Recognition not for his work or his survival, but for who he truly was. As the days turned into weeks, he began to regain more independence. He could walk longer distances without assistance, eat without help, and even manage small tasks alone. Each accomplishment, no matter how small, felt monumental. Every time he succeeded, the young woman celebrated quietly, her encouragement always sincere. She never made him feel weak for needing help, nor did she push him beyond his limits. Her balance of care and respect gave him confidence, allowing him to heal both physically and emotionally. During one particularly quiet afternoon, she asked him what he planned to do once he left the hospital. The rancher thought for a long time. "Go home," he said simply, "to the ranch, to the land, to the animals." But then he hesitated. "But I want to do it differently this time. I don't want to be alone. I want to be part of something again. I want to connect." Her smile was gentle, encouraging. "That sounds like a good plan, and you're not alone anymore, not entirely, and you don't have to be." The rancher reflected on those words often. The idea that he didn't have to face the world alone was strange, almost foreign, but it also felt freeing. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future where he could ask for help, where he could share his life with others, where he could build meaningful connections rather than simply surviving day to day. Their conversations also turned to practical matters. They discussed what he would need at home to live safely and comfortably, the changes required to ensure he would not face another health crisis alone, and ways to reconnect with the community. She helped him plan visits from neighbors, guided him in organizing his home for easier movement, and suggested small ways to include others in his daily life. These discussions were never overwhelming. She offered advice gently, allowing him to make the choices. As the rancher prepared to leave the hospital, he felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Returning to the ranch was not just about going back to familiar land. It was about returning to life itself. The young woman helped him pack his belongings and coordinated with the hospital staff to ensure he would have support at home. She made certain he had medical supplies, a system to call for help if needed, and a small network of neighbors who could check on him. On the day of his discharge, the rancher looked back at the hospital one last time. He remembered the fear he had felt when he first arrived, the despair that had nearly consumed him, and the moments of hope that had been planted by a stranger's courage and kindness. He realized that life had given him a second chance and he would honor it. Back at the ranch, the world felt different. The familiar fields, the barn, the animals, they were still there, but he saw them with new eyes. He appreciated the quiet beauty of the land, the rhythm of daily work, and the simple joys he had taken for granted. He noticed the sunrise casting long shadows over the snow, the way the wind moved through the trees, and the soft sounds of the animals stirring. Life, he realized, was not only about work and survival. It was about awareness, appreciation, and connection. The young woman helped him settle in, arranging supplies, helping feed the animals, and making the ranch feel like a home again. Their bond, formed through crisis, had deepened into a strong, unspoken trust. She was no longer just a visitor or helper. She was a part of the rancher's renewed life, a companion in a quiet but meaningful way. Over the following weeks, the rancher regained more strength, and his confidence grew. He began to take walks around the property, checking fences, feeding animals, and working in the barn. The tasks that had once felt routine now brought satisfaction and a sense of accomplishment. Each day was a small victory, a reminder that life, though fragile, could also be beautiful. The young woman continued to visit, sometimes helping directly, other times simply sitting and sharing quiet moments. They talked about dreams, plans, and the future. The rancher began to see possibilities he had long ignored, reconnecting with neighbors, inviting help when needed, and participating in the community. He realized that life was not meant to be endured alone. It was meant to be shared, cherished, and lived with awareness. By the end of this part of his recovery, the rancher had transformed, not only physically, but emotionally and mentally. He was no longer the isolated, lonely man who had collapsed in his home. He was a man who had faced death and returned, who had discovered the power of kindness and courage, and who was learning to embrace life in a way he never had before. And through it all, the young woman remained a quiet, guiding presence, a reminder that even in the darkest nights, human connection, compassion, and care could bring light, hope, and the strength to continue. The rancher stepped off the small ambulance and onto the snow-covered path leading to his home. The cold air bit at his cheeks, but he welcomed it. It was different from the hospital's sterile rooms and artificial lights. This was real life, the land he had spent decades caring for, and now he was returning to it with new eyes. Every breath he took felt precious. Every sound, the crunch of snow under his boots, the distant call of a bird, the soft stir of animals in the barn, reminded him that life had not abandoned him. The young woman walked beside him, steadying him whenever the uneven ground threatened his balance. She carried a small bag with supplies, a few tools to help him settle in, and a quiet warmth that made the walk less daunting. She had been there from the beginning, guiding him through the fragile days of recovery, and now she was with him as he reclaimed his home. The rancher looked at her, gratitude shining in his eyes, but words were unnecessary. She understood without explanation. Inside the house, everything was quiet yet familiar. The old wooden floors creaked beneath their steps, the familiar scent of the barn still lingered faintly, and the furniture, though simple, carried decades of memories. The rancher moved slowly, careful not to overexert himself, and she helped him unpack what little he had brought from the hospital. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his solitude lifted, replaced by the comforting presence of someone who truly cared. The animals in the barn sensed his return immediately. The horses neighed softly, the cows moved toward the gate, and even the smaller animals stirred with quiet curiosity. He walked among them slowly, touching each one, whispering gentle words. It was as if they had waited for him and now he was home again. The young woman stood nearby, smiling softly. She had seen the transformation that had begun in the hospital, how fragile and scared he had once been, and now how determined and alive he had become. Days passed, each filled with small victories and meaningful moments. The rancher tended to the animals, checked fences, and repaired equipment he had left unattended during his illness. Each task reminded him of the value of hard work, but now it was paired with the understanding that he did not have to face challenges alone. He could ask for help, rely on support, and still take pride in his efforts. This balance, he realized, was a gift he had never allowed himself before. The young woman continued to visit regularly. She brought supplies, helped with chores, and spent time sharing quiet moments of conversation. They talked about life, the changes he had experienced, and the lessons learned from the near loss of his life. She encouraged him to reconnect with neighbors, to reach out to old friends, and even to write letters to his children. At first, the idea felt uncomfortable. He had been isolated for so long that opening up to others seemed unnecessary. But slowly, he began to see the value in connection, in sharing his life with those who cared. One morning, as the sun rose over the snow-covered fields, the rancher decided to take his first solo walk around the property since his return. The air was crisp, and the land looked beautiful in the soft morning light. He noticed the subtle changes he had never paid attention to before, the way the wind moved through the trees, the patterns in the snow, the small footprints of animals that had wandered nearby. Each observation reminded him that life was not just survival, it was noticing, appreciating, and being present. When he returned, the young woman greeted him with a warm smile. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Alive," he said simply, and for the first time in years it was true. He began to make more permanent changes to his life. He arranged for neighbors to help with heavy chores, repaired his home to make it safer, and even prepared a small garden for fresh vegetables in the coming spring. These changes were not just practical, they were symbolic. They represented his willingness to embrace life fully, to accept help, and to build a life that included others, not just the land and animals. The rancher also began to reconnect with his past. He wrote letters to his children, sharing his experience and his gratitude for the life he had lived. He reached out to friends he had lost contact with, rebuilding relationships that had long been neglected. Each letter, each visit, reminded him that human connection was as vital as breathing, as necessary as the work he had always valued. The young woman noticed the change in him each day. The fear and weakness that had once dominated his life were now replaced by hope and determination. She encouraged him, sometimes gently, sometimes with quiet humor, to embrace life fully. Together they worked on small projects, repaired old fences, organized supplies, and tended to the animals. Their bond, forged in crisis, had grown into a partnership built on respect, trust, and shared experience. One afternoon, as the rancher sat watching the sunset over the fields, he felt a sense of peace he had not known in decades. The snow glowed softly in the fading light, the animals moved quietly in the distance, and the young woman stood nearby, preparing to leave after her daily visit. He turned to her, gratitude in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "You don't have to," she replied. "Seeing you live, seeing you find your strength again, that's enough." Her words stayed with him long after she left. They were simple yet profound. She had given him more than life. She had given him hope, perspective, and the courage to embrace a future he had once believed was beyond reach. As winter turned to spring, the rancher continued to heal. His strength returned, his movements became more confident, and his days were filled with purpose. He tended to the animals with care, repaired the barn and fences, and spent time walking the fields, noticing every detail he had once overlooked. Life felt rich, meaningful, and full of small joys. The young woman remained a steady presence, not as someone who controlled his life, but as a companion who supported him. She encouraged him to take risks, to engage with the community, and to rebuild relationships he had long neglected. Their bond was quiet but unbreakable, a partnership built not on obligation, but on genuine care and shared experience. One evening, the rancher sat by the fireplace, reflecting on the journey he had taken. He thought about the night he had almost died, the young woman who had saved him, and the weeks of recovery that had followed. He realized that life had given him a second chance, a chance to live differently, to embrace connection, and to appreciate every moment. He had survived not only because of his own strength, but because someone had cared enough to act. The rancher knew that the future would not be without challenges. The land required constant attention, the animals needed care, and his health would always demand awareness. But now he faced these challenges with confidence, support, and a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer alone, no longer isolated, and no longer afraid. Spring arrived fully, melting the snow and bringing new life to the ranch. Green shoots appeared in the fields, the animals thrived, and the rancher worked each day with energy and determination. He welcomed visitors from the town, reconnected with neighbors, and began sharing his knowledge and experience with younger farmers. His life, once narrow and lonely, had expanded into a network of meaningful relationships and shared responsibilities. The young woman continued her visits, though less frequently now, as the rancher had regained independence. Their connection remained strong, a quiet but powerful reminder of the night that had changed everything. She had shown him that life, even on the edge of death, could be beautiful, full of meaning, and worth living fully. One evening, as the rancher watched the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a sense of completeness he had never known. He had survived, healed, and transformed. He had learned the value of connection, the importance of care, and the power of compassion. Life was no longer a series of lonely struggles. It was a story he could live, share, and cherish every day. The rancher smiled quietly, thinking of the young woman and the journey they had shared. He realized that her presence had not only saved his life, but had also given him the courage to live fully, to embrace others, and to find joy in the ordinary moments of each day. For the first time in decades, he felt truly alive. And so, the rancher continued his life on the land he loved, no longer defined by isolation, illness, or fear. He faced each day with gratitude, connection, and purpose, knowing that a single act of kindness had changed everything. The story of his near death and the young woman who brought him back to life remained a quiet but profound truth, that even in the darkest moments, hope, courage, and compassion could create miracles, and that life, when embraced fully, was always worth living.